Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about sending away our best and brightest to an American diaspora. America's move from Enlightenment to a new dark age. Our co-host for the show is Tim Apicella. Our guests for the show are Ben Davis, the University of Toledo College of Law, Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar, Manfred Henningsen, Emeritus Professor in Political Philosophy. Welcome to you all to the show. Part of America's historical success is the intellectual, scientific, and medical study and research that has been done over the years, especially recently. Much of it made possible by funding from the federal government. Those programs are now being systematically destroyed by the Trump administration. And the individuals involved, the talent is leaving. They're leaving their fields and leaving the country. The destruction is enormous, profound, and in some cases permanent, many cases permanent. And we need to find out why Trump is bent on doing this and what he hopes to achieve and what the impact is on the country and the future. Wow, what a situation. Tim, let me start with you. Why do you think Trump is doing this?
I think this comes from the 2025 playbook put out by the Heritage Foundation. J.D. Vance said it very clearly, is that if we want to change the mega culture and have it as a predominant force, we've got to attack the universities, because it's the universities that are instilling this philosophy of liberalism and wokeness. It's the universities have been, identified as what's wrong with America because they're producing students that, in reality, are open-minded and are critical thinkers. But mega movement doesn't like critical thinkers. They don't like people who are informed, so they make informed choices in life and or how they vote. So you have to go to the source of where MAGA thinks the threat becomes prevalent, and that is the universities. And of course, they picked Harvard. They picked the wrong target, I think, but they went right after the stereotypical bastion of liberalism.
If you keep on doing this, Ben, and you keep on knocking off the intellectuals, and Trump uses the expression intellectuals, which is it's a denigration. And you keep on doing that, and you get rid of the researchers, the scientists, thinkers from the schools, but also from the country, and you send them away or you suppress them. What kind of a country do you have? What's the end game on that?
It's already happened. There's a brain drain people going up to Canada, going to Germany, going to France. I think there's a university in Hong Kong that has invited any international student to come and transfer there just for students. So there's that aspect of sort of the reverse of what happened prior to World War II, where you had the German intelligentsia. A lot of it came over to escape the oppression of Hitler. The other thing, though, is it's hitting red states particularly bad because, for example, one of the schools that is losing grants, there's a lot of focus on Harvard, but is the University of Alabama in Birmingham, which is the largest employer in Birmingham, Alabama. University of Tennessee is another place that's getting hit. University of Mississippi. These are all, red state schools that are getting hit by this. And so, in a way, it seems to be if I was going to say the whole strategy was make life more awful for the people who vote for you, and then have them blame somebody else than you. In the meantime, you're making a lot of money. That's the way it looks like, and it really. And I know he said that he likes people who have not gone to college. So the other side of that is that he wants to, if we want to get to this kind of rigid ideological vision of what should happen at a university, that's essentially dumbing people down, because the idea of college was what? To learn to think, right? To think critically. Well, what they're trying to do is to make sure that people don't think critically, right? Well, that's dumbing us down, and it's dumbing down a whole generation of people. So, he likes those folks because those folks, he says, tend to vote for him. I think that's his idea.
Yeah, well, it's on the path to dictatorship. That's what it seems like. Manfred, we had a brilliant scientist by the name of Wernher von Braun, came from Germany. He was actually a Nazi. And the United States recruited him to work on rockets, and he made great contributions to the United States. And it's so odd now that some of our best scientists are leaving the United States and going to work for Germany. What do you make of that? Is Germany offering them something that's irresistible?
Look, I wouldn't use Van von Braun. I would look at the list of American Nobel Prize winners since the end of World War One, and you will find there an enormous number of people who were born in Germany, German Jews. The majority, I think, of the American Nobel Prize winners in the sciences are from Europe, leaving the Soviet Union after the revolution in 1819, fascist Italy, National Socialist Germany. And now you can add, the PRC, the People's Republic of China. So what you have had is an influx of uh, foreign intelligence into the United States, but not only in the sciences, in the humanities as well. The American universities, have benefited from this exodus from those countries in an enormous way. Graduate education in the United States got a boost after World War One for that regard. And I saw a statistic in 2023, you had 1.3 million foreign students getting a degree in the United States at universities. Now, the two largest contingents were from India and China. Now, a lot of them certainly would like to stay here and work here and do whatever work they have gotten degrees in, but that will stop, and they will return, or they will go to other places. You have, for example, from Germany, 9,000 students at American universities now. And I saw in German newspapers, complaints by all kinds of students who had already been admitted by American universities, but are now waiting for their visas being approved, and most of them won't get it, in time. So what you have here, is not only a brain drain that is beginning to leave the United States, but there is a cutting off. And on top of that, you have the declining population in the United States, and now they are losing people in certain groups, age groups, because they don't either want to stay, or they want to go somewhere else. So I think what you have, you asked for the reasons. Well, there's an anti-intellectual prejudice, in the guy who doesn't think very deeply, Trump. His resentment, of, it's not simply the elites, but of people who are critically thinking about the world. So in a way, this is an attack on an understanding of reality being based on facts. Universities try to do that, and Trump lives in a universe of alternative facts.
Let's look at what it's like in Europe. If I say I had enough of this, I'm afraid of Trump, I'm afraid of what the country is becoming. The decline is, too troublesome to me. So I'm taking off, and I'm a physicist, or maybe I'm somebody in the arts, and I got to get out of here. So I look around at Europe, and let's look at Germany. We can look at other countries too. But what do those societies offer me that make it attractive? Aside from an escape, it's an escape, but it's also attractive. So what is the experience like to move to Europe, to move to Germany or France, And what are they offering?
Most European universities you don't have to pay tuition. They're free. Higher education is free. I mean, it doesn't apply in all countries to American students, but that is one of the major attractions, for a lot of foreign students going to European university, especially from Germany. Um, and I, the attraction, I mean, going to a European country at this point, not only Germany is the social system as well, healthcare. Um, they may not get as much money as you get in the US, but all of the other benefits, make up for that. So for
Mm.
that reason, I think you have then the attraction in Germany, is an unbelievable cultural richness. Every city has an opera, symphony orchestra, all of them paid by the cities and the states. So I mean, you always had a lot of, for example, black opera singers at in Germany, and that has continued. Um, so in that sense, you have an infrastructure, and Germany is needing people as much as other European countries do, and has been so far very open. I mean, 20% of Germans today have a migrant background, and more than the United States. It's 17% here. So you have, I mean, you have also I mean, you have racism in Germany, certainly also, but I mean, it's not, uh, it is not like in Hungary or in other places. So for that reason, I think Germany, as well as other European societies, are not only intellectually attractive, but also socially attractive.
But what about the man on the street or the woman on the street? Are they going to like an American immigrant, an American intellectual? Are they going to put their arms around his shoulder and say, "We welcome you here. We want you here. We believe that because of the bell curve, Europe is on the wrong side of the bell curve these days. We believe that you will help our society and give us progress." As General Electric used to say, progress is our most important product. And that means research, it means education. And does the average person in Europe recognize that and express that to an emigre?
Yes and no. I mean, they embraced the intellectual immigration into, for example, Germany. Um, and, you know, Amer- black GIs have, in a way, removed for decades the racist aspect. The 2 million black GIs that were stationed in Germany from 45 to recently have contributed in an amazing way to overcoming anti-black racism in the west of Germany, not in the east. In the east, you have now, racism as a result because they have not been socialized under communism to accept people. They had the Vietnamese and Angolan foreign workers, but they lived in camps. So they didn't have any. There was no inter relationship, that you had in West Germany.
That is so interesting, Manfred. And more than interesting, it informs us about the factors that are in play. Gene, I want to talk about racism for a minute. I want to talk about the connection for Trump and the Republicans, the MAGAs, between immigration in this country, which is visibly racist, but also against permanent residents and citizens. What's the connection? It seems to be that racism and the differentiation between races is raising its ugly head in this country. And it's just another reason to worry about the future, to worry about scapegoatism, not only for immigrants and migrants, but for anybody on the wrong side of a divide. Your thoughts about the way this country is working in terms of the divisiveness and the way it's moving?
First, a footnote on Manfred. My son has lived and worked in Germany, East Germany, for 6 years, and he's been completely integrated into the society. As for racism, behind the Trump movement, there's an ideology that has built up since the 1970s. Most people, most Americans were not aware that mostly in the rural areas and among fundamentalist evangelical communities, there was a retrograde sense of white nationalism. And that now has come to the fore inexplicably, but to our surprise, with a major political movement which has taken over the Republican Party and elevated to the presidency for 2 terms, a charismatic leader who's come from outside the political establishment, basically from infotainment and from entrepreneurship. And so the basic ideology of this underground white nationalism is the Great Replacement theory, that it comes out of the Ku Klux Klan and the unreconstructed Southern ideologies that there should be segregation among the races in America, and it would be very nice if non-whites would simply fade out. What you see in the early Trump administration policies against immigration and DEI, which are of a piece, is a racist campaign to root out the progress of diversity in the last 50 years.
So, Gene, what is the connection between all of that and the subject of our show, which is sending away our best and brightest, our researchers, our scientists, our intellectuals, sending them away? What's the connection between the racism and what is happening?
The connection is meritocracy. I mean, what do universities do? They extract from the population the best and the brightest and attempt to educate them to run the country and to influence future generations and to enhance our civilization. The attack on the universities is an attack on this. Meritocracy respects no racial bounds. Meritocracy is found among the lower classes even more because they have fewer resources to potentiate their skills. When I was a teacher of children, you could see as much brightness in the kids from the lower socioeconomic classes. And because they were more numerous, there were brighter ones. I mean, I come out of a blue collar immigrant society myself in Compton, and I went to Stanford University on a scholarship. Now, if it hadn't been for that scholarship, I wouldn't have gone to Stanford. I wouldn't have gone on to improve my situation in life. And now my grandkids are the sons of 2 surgeons. So, out of this has come the greatness of America, and he's destroying it because he has embraced, and his movement has embraced, this ideology, which he likes to obscure, of whiteness.
Let me go to Tim for a minute here. Tim, I saved this question for you. Don't you love when I save a question for you?
I do.
It's a special question. We've been talking about Europe, and a lot of scientists will go to Canada, for example, and they are going to Canada, and they are going to Europe, and that's good. And we can talk about the benefits to Canada and the benefits to Europe and the detriment to the United States. But it's much more complicated when you're talking about China. Can you talk about China? Can you talk about Chinese Americans and Chinese nationals who are here within the academic community and how they are leaving or being tempted to leave in a time when the government is making it clear that it wants to get rid of our best and brightest and send them away? What is happening? Can you give us the 4 corners of that experience with China?
When you say Chinese Americans, are we talking about those on student visas or working visas, or are we talking about citizens that are Americans with Chinese descent?
All of the foregoing.
All of the foregoing. Okay, so I don't think there's a strong lure. Now, this is my personal feeling, and I know you threw this question at me to trip me up, but I don't think there's I don't think there's a strong lure for citizens of the United States to go to China. I think a lot of people did it back in the '90s as an adventure. Certainly, maybe they thought there were some opportunities on an economic basis, but I think though if I'm a student and on a student visa, or if I'm a assistant professor or a professor on a education work visa, yeah, I don't think I want to get deported. I don't want to live in fear. But remember, once you leave a country and you come to a new country, I don't care where it is. You start, as Gene said, you start to integrate into that society. You become comfortable with it. You start to lose your identity with the country which you left, and it depends on how young you were when you left a country anywhere in the world. You become, identified. I'll go to the Italian Americans. A lot of them naturalized. They said, I'm now a U.S. citizen. I'm not a citizen of Italy any longer, and they lost their citizenship that way. And so I don't think it's any different from China, from Brazil, from Italy, or anywhere else in Europe or around the world. Your new home is your new home, and you try to contribute to it. You try to enhance it. You take your skills that you've been given and your education, and you try to make society a better place to live. So I'm not exactly bought and sold on the idea that there's a mass migration away from the United States back to China. I think some of it's happening, but I can't blame students thinking that they're going to be soon deported.
You raised two interesting issues. One is the Hawaii issue. You know, a lot of kids in Hawaii who are smart and who have done the best they could do at they leave. They go to the mainland. They get better jobs at the mainland. There are not so many jobs here. And once they go to the mainland, they meet a nice spouse and they marry and they have children. And just as you say, they integrate into that society, and it's hard to bring them back. Some of them do come back, but for the most part, they don't come back. So once you make the move, as with these people who are leaving for Europe or Canada, it's hard to come back. You've already established your new life. But I was also thinking about this. You know, we live in a time of transition, transformation, some people say. And whether the US likes it or not, the US is involved in global transformation. And when we lose people, especially our brightest, our best and our brightest, to either Europe or Asia, we are part of a global trend, if you will, a global phenomenon where people are crossing borders, they're crossing cultures, they're crossing educational institutions, they're crossing economic barriers. And so China is an interesting barrier in the sense that China is very, dedicated to try to convince everyone in the world that it is the best place. Beautiful middle-class cities, decent economy, although they're having a little trouble now. Lots of education, so many PhDs in China, so many really smart technology people. It's got to be attractive for some people. I remember, as you do, back, 10 or 15 years ago, when the Chinese government was offering jobs and laboratories and what have you, research facilities to American researchers out of American schools and saying, we will give you more resources, more assistance, more value than you could get in the US. And this is not only so for China, it's so for Singapore, it's so for Japan, and probably for Korea. But the point is, you can wean people away from the US with incentives like that. And I suggest to you that's one of the ways in which China could expedite the migration of American talent to China. I'm not sure it's happening in high numbers right now, but I think there's a real possibility, and I think Xi Jinping would like to do that. He recognizes, and this is my next question to you, he recognizes that if he can take your talent and what you have learned, your understanding of the inner workings of your science, then he can enhance his own society. And furthermore, he can decline your society.
Well, I think that's a natural outfall of trying to attract another country's best and brightest. I'm always thinking of Ireland and how much brain drain they had because there was just simply no opportunities, economic opportunities, and how the United States was the beneficiary of a lot of that. And around the world, the Irish had one of the best education systems in the world. I think they still do. Yet it's hard to retain those that have graduated and have them stay there. And it wasn't for necessarily the cost of living issues. It was there was just not enough opportunities. So it depends on the lure, I guess. Japan talks a great game about trying to attract people in society, but they really is what they say versus what they want are two different things. They want they want people to come in, but they don't want necessarily non-Japanese people, and that's why their society is having some huge gaps in employment and in all sorts of positions in Japan to fill because they're just not interested in how should I say mixing of the society and the culture and the race. But that's where they're at. Where China, I think, seems to be open to it. Um, and I think you know to some degree you're right. It's a detraction from one, and it's an addition to the other. China would be the beneficiary of attracting our best and brightest.
Ben, you spent decades in Europe, and you got to see the way African Americans and Africans were treated in Europe. You got to see how you were treated in Europe, and I would ask you, is that an attractive place for an African American intellect? Um, say a law professor, say a scientist to go these days. Is it accepting? Is it more accepting for an African than a Howley person? What's the situation? What does the Black community think about that?
Jay, I would kind of go along with some of the things that have been said by Manfred and Gene and by Tim too, and you, uh, to take a look at that. So I'll go back just quickly to before World War I. There were segregated army or segregated American military came in at World War I. In fact, the black soldiers, I think, were basically, like logistics people moving trucks and food and things like that. Um, but one of the things was that, for example, in France, the French just treated them like people. That's all. I mean, there's humans, okay? And the consequence of that was that the American military wrote to all the prefects of France and said, please do not fraternize, tell your people not to fraternize with the blacks because it's bothering the white Americans. And they sent that to their liaisons, right? And the French liaisons took those things and they threw them in the paper and ignored it. I threw it in the trash and ignored it. The first airplane, the first, what do you call it, military pilot that was a black man was born in Georgia named Eugene Bullard. And he flew with the French. And then when the Lafayette Escadrille was put in place, they wouldn't admit him as a black in that. They didn't want him, to have a black member of this kind of elite group of people whose parents, like the Vanderbilts and all that, could buy them their own plane, so to speak. And so there are these kinds of opportunities that were presented in the interwar years. This guy Eugene Bullard had one of the hottest bars in Paris, where it was kind of like the way when you watch Ricks in Casablanca, that's what he had going on. And when the Nazis came into power, you know, they would come to his bar and all that. And they thought, of course, that he couldn't speak German, but he actually could speak German. So he became part of the French resistance, telling what the Germans were saying. I'm just telling you this kind of real stuff. We can talk about Josephine Baker. We can talk about all kinds. This is the American black thing. To distinguish the American black thing from the African black thing, and when I was there for 17 years, a Frenchman said, the thing about me is that I'm westernized. That was the distinction that he said. I'm westernized. No matter how I act, I am fundamentally westernized. And that's a distinction he made about the way of Black Americans were treated as opposed to Africans. Isn't that interesting? And they had all these colonies in Africa too.
Mm.
And there's the whole assimilationist thing going on, you know? But that was the way the guy said it to me, which, made me kind of laugh when I come back to the United States and I'm going to talk to these groups of people from, white, black, green, and yellow, and I'm laughing in a way because everybody's an American. You know what I mean? It's like we are, we can't, we can't take it away. It's just that. So one of the things I'd say, therefore, that was great in France is that obviously I wasn't French. So since I'm not French, I'm not civilized. Understand? Because I'm part of the world that is not French, and as a consequence, you can't be civilized because you're not French. That's it. And this is not a pejorative on the French. This is just saying an
Yeah.
attitude. To be civilized is to be French. And unfortunately, I'm not French.
Hey, Ben, we're all treated that way when we go to France.
Right. Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. But the thing about the French was that they always made you feel like you were human. This is very important. That you were treated, you go up to the bar, want a coffee, they give you a coffee. You don't have to go through a whole routine of the guy looking at you a little weird. You know what I mean? I'm saying, you know, and so the difference, because I used to have Americans who would come to Paris all the time when I lived there, and you're to say, so, what's it like in France? And you really like the United States better. I had to come up with some kind of answer. And I said, well, the thing about France is that I know I'm not French, so I'm not civilized, but they always treat me as a human. And I said, in the United States, sometimes people, the way they related to me, it wasn't clear that they actually thought I was human. You see what I'm saying? It's because it comes back from the whole slavery, segregation, all that stuff and all that. And that's the difference. Now, trust me, there are different kinds of freedom in Europe, different kinds of freedom in Germany from here in the States, different kinds of freedom than in the States, in France. Freedom that's like, going to a restaurant, ordering something, having somebody treat you, all the sort of walking down the street. I mean, Richard Wright, who left in 1940, not 49, he said that there was more freedom in one square block of Paris than there was in the entire state of Mississippi. Okay. You know, and but the thing is as I learned over the years that I was there, is that there are limits because you're an immigrant. You know,
Uh-huh.
there are definitely limits because you're an immigrant. I'm not saying that it's nasty, but it's like you're not French. Like you never saw somebody being a head of a French company that was not French. You know what I mean? I mean, those kind of things, sort of. And so you knew that there were sort of limits, and then there's a cultural thing because it's deep French culture. You worked in a place that was very Franco-French, you were kind of the outsider. But if you found yourself into a more international space where it was a more mix of people, then you could probably thrive a little better. You see, these are the kinds of things that happen when you make that kind of move abroad. But after 17 years, we came back. My wife was American. I was American. We adopted 2 kids. Why? Because we didn't like the way the French educational system was turning our kids into French kids. I mean, this is the American kind of jumps out at 17 years in, and we missed the whole idea of like college. You 4 years in college, figuring out what the hell you're going to do with yourself. In France, at like 16, you were put on, this is your track. And so that was the moment where it said, let's come back to the States. Now, when you come back, I just want to say this last part of it is that you are very out of phase, even if you visited every year, with what's going on in America. You're kind of an immigrant coming back to the States. And um, you know, one of the funniest things was when I was teaching. One time, I was on a Halloween. I was at a 7-Eleven, and you know, I was in line. There's some kids who were waiting, and so anyway, the guy said, "Let him go ahead." So okay, and one of these kids says, "Yeah, let the OG go through." And I was like, OG, what is OG? I completely missed that. Well, there's another thing since I've been teaching in law school is that students would sometimes say, well, he's, SOL. And I'd be, SOL, what is that? I missed that whole development of that sort of jargon and slang. And I'm still learning things that I missed.
So what was it?
So SOL is shit out of luck. Okay. And that developed somewhere there between 1983 and 2000. Okay. And then the OG, I actually went on a listserv and said, "What's an OG?" And they said to me, "Well, it's an original gangster." I said, "Oh, okay." I says, and it's an honorific that were given, and there's one of two reasons. Either I was very well dressed, which, as you can see, I'm always very well dressed, right?
Don't
Or
exaggerate.
thank you. Or I look like a real tough guy, like I used to be a mafia hitman. I did 10 years in Sing Sing and I came out and I'm living in society. And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm a law professor, tough guy, law professor. I give people F's, man, I give D's, I give exams. Anyway, but but that OG thing was completely, I had no clue what that was.
That was then, and we are now. What I mean is that social media, the internet, would sort of level that playing field, and people everywhere would know what is happening everywhere else, right? Don't you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for my kids, for example, with the internet and all that, they've been able to keep their ties with their friends in France. They're back here in the States, right? And so that kind of across the world connection thing that would have been just by letters back in the day, right? You can do that. I'm sure Jean with her son, can do a FaceTime or something like that. Well, back in the day, it was the son writing a letter. As when I was a kid in the early '70s, in the late '60s, hi, I'm doing, Dad. Hi, Ma, how you doing? That was a little blue piece of paper, airmail that would send a letter, and a week or two later, you get a letter back from your parents. Right now, it's the connection is just like that. But
Yeah.
what would somebody like going into these kinds of environments? I don't care what your color is. I think the thing that you would like is a kind of cultural anonymity that America has a very narrow culture in terms of what is considered left and right. And Manfred and Jean maybe will disagree with me, but to me, one of the things I loved about Paris was that there were like 6 different newspapers talking about the exact same thing, but going from the extreme left to the extreme right, and it was just like that, and it was just a breadth of discussion. That was something that I found really enjoyable. So that's one of the things
Yeah.
that I felt in Europe.
Let me go to Manfred. Manfred, people say that the heart of research has been, and especially mm, technological research, both hardware and software, and in the software department, especially AI. The heart of it has been here in this country, mostly in California, but some on the East Coast too. And we have had the best and the brightest doing that. And what is troublesome, and there have been some commentators who have covered this, what is troublesome is that the oligarchs control the big companies that control this technology, and Trump controls the oligarchs. And so what you have is a change in the way technology works, and the consolidation of technology capital and companies. So it has been successful. And then you go to Europe and you don't find that. You find some very bright people doing very important research, but it is simply not the same as it has been in the US. And my question to you is if our best and brightest go to Europe and they get involved in similar projects, and they leave their projects here in the United States, will Europe be able to achieve the same level of scientific, technological, intellectual progress or not?
It's certainly, and I mean the interconnectedness that you have, it it's quite remarkable. I know that from the Technical University in Munich, uh, where they do AI research on a grand scale, and have a relative who is a professor there, and he's traveling around in the US as well in other parts of the world constantly with his students, and they become hired. No, I think you have a somewhat limited perspective of what is possible in Europe. But let me, in that regard, let me. There are two things that I wanted to mention. You know, when we are speaking about the brain drain from the U.S., the possible brain drain, we don't know whether it has actually. Well, it has started. You know, when you think of Tim Snyder and the historians going to Toronto University, but it's not only the uh, accomplished scientists, whether in the humanities or the natural sciences, that may leave. But what I think is more dangerous for the American intellectual future is that the pool of youngsters who come to the United States, and two of the major groups of these youngsters are Chinese and Indian, will not be able, of getting this access that they have had before. So the United States is not only kicking out uh, accomplished scientists, but preventing future scientists from establishing
Oh,
themselves
that is
in this
so
country.
important, Manfred. That is a tremendous point.
Yes, and I think one has to. I don't think Trump, when he is speaking about immigration and all of these crazy guys that are uh, managing, immigration at this point, are aware of that either. They don't know what they are doing because they're ignorant of the world. And I mean, some of them are Ivy League graduates. It's very sad to say, this stupidity is not limited to people without degrees.
Thank
It doesn't matter. You may be uh, stupid or even worse with the degrees. I mean, in the
That's
DSS
quotable, Manfred.
had a lot of PhDs. Uh, so for that reason, I think we should not only look at the brain drain in terms of accomplished people leaving, as they did, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and uh, Soviet Russia, but we do not have the replenishment. Uh, the pool will become smaller and smaller.
Yeah. Gene, I want to go to you. I've been looking at Spain lately, and Spain is resisting tourists. Now, Barcelona is just an amazing city, very creative. Uh, um, it has liberty, equality, and fraternity, just like France wanted to have back when. On the other hand, Spain is resisting tourists and resisting Americans coming and investing in real estate, including apartments and homes. And you wonder whether there is resistance to the best and brightest in some countries where they really can't get in. They have to demonstrate that they have assets of maybe millions. They have to demonstrate that their credentials are so good that that country cannot resist but to take them. And I wonder if you see that as a problem, either now or in the future, when it's likely that more and more Americans will, especially qualified Americans, will seek to have a second life somewhere else.
In general, Americans, for the first time in a long time, are looking seriously into changing their location. And they're looking first to Europe, interestingly enough. Of course, Anglophone countries, but also countries that speak other languages because English has been a lingua franca and you can get along in English. My brother in law went to veterinary school in Spain 40 years ago, and he's still in Spain. And he found his calling there and he found his family there. And he is totally assimilated, but he's still American. And even though his reasons for going there were the opposite of what you would think, he went there for an education because he couldn't get into veterinary school in California, which had the highest standards in the United States. And so he made a successful transition. But there's an interesting phenomenon anthropologically. And that is the notion that your nation, your country, your nation state is the only civilized group of people in the world is very commonplace. It was common to Greece, which gave us the word for barbarian, because all these other people could say was bar, 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 bar. They couldn't speak Greek. Of course, it's very hard to speak Greek. And then, yeah, and then the Indians feel that they have, a ancient civilization more ancient than the Pakistanis, of course, and anybody else. The Chinese feel that they are the center of the world. The French, we know about the French, and Europeans in general have felt that the United States is full of people who are unsophisticated and rubes, so to speak.
And they
So,
still are.
so what happens? Yes, there he goes. I knew it. Is that when you try to make a cultural transition, as Americans think they want to do for political reasons today, and they get over there and they live there for a year or two, they find out that they're missing elements of their own culture and they're
Yes.
not fully integrated into that culture.
Yes.
So most people don't make the grade. Even coming from the mainland to Hawaii is a cultural transition.
Yes.
I'll know that, being those of us who are Haole or non Pacific Islander know that, or non Japanese. Now, interestingly, individuals who can transcend these boundaries, and Obama is one of these people, we call them liminal people. He grew up in Hawaii, which is with white grandparents who basically were in lieu of his mother and father, who were not around for a good part of his life. And then, he transferred to the mainland. He's still coming to Hawaii back to be with his groupies, his friends. But his wife was from Chicago, and that's a totally different Black culture from Hawaii. So Obama's brother, as it turns out, is an emigrated China and has lived there for many, many years. So you see, people who transcend these boundaries tend to have experiences in their earlier lives, which kind of give them the background, which is intercultural, I will call that. They call it intersectionality in academics.
It's like global trade. Global trade. It's the same thing. It's good for you. It's good for the world.
Those people who have that kind of background already have a leg up in making that transition. Whether or not Americans can go and stay is another question. Of course, we had people escaping Nazi Germany who came to Santa Monica and Pacific Palisades, great people like Thomas Mann and Hannah Arendt and others, and great scientists who made the transition because they had to, or people escaping real persecution. But that's not what people in the United States are doing.
Not yet, Gene, but there may come a time when this is much more pressing. Well, let's go to final comments, Tim, if you don't mind. And would you mind delivering your final comments in Greek?
Not so well in Greek, but I'll give it a go. To kind of just stay on this theme here, I think a lot of Americans, in the last 20 years, 30 years, we're seeing an economic disparity, a polarization of economics, the haves and the have-nots, and those that are, recently retired, and they're finding that their dollar doesn't go as far here in the United States. So they're picking Mexico, they're picking Costa Rica, they're picking Panama, they're picking nations that have a lower cost of living and saying, we'll make that transition, we'll because it's economically beneficial to do so. And I think that's a big part of why we are losing a lot of Americans, particularly retirees, to foreign countries, not just for economic freedom for educational purposes and the freedom to practice and teach the way they would like to. So I just think that we're going to have more migration due to economic disparity. I think we're going to have more migrations due to environmental conditions in many countries, including our own. I think the South is going to be getting hotter and tougher to live in with higher humidity. And the West Coast will see migration patterns. Hawaii will see an influx of those that can afford it to get out of Texas at 110 degrees with 90% humidity. That can't be sustained each and every day for months on end. Something's going to change, and it's going to be either economics or the environment.
Great, very important points. Manfred, I want to turn west for a minute. I want to ask you about China. I had a luncheon one time with the vice mayor of Beijing, and I said to him, it's wonderful in China. 29% of your graduates are graduating in engineering. That's got to help the country. And he said, really appreciate that thought, but in fact, it's not 29%; it's 59%. And I realized that China is very into education. Has been a lot of its PhDs, and there are many PhDs in China are into engineering and science and research, and including medical research. So I'm wondering your thoughts about this. China is very well educated. Isn't China going to be the leading creative country in the world with all of that education? We are losing it and they are gaining it, whether it's by immigration, probably not so much, or by their own educational facilities. Your thoughts?
Look, I've been traveling in China from 1988 until 2020. And I have a lot of PhD students in China. They invited me, giving talks at universities. And I have a very positive image of China, but the PRC is governed by the Communist Party, and the restrictions that that regime is putting on people who are intellectually curious is very powerful. And so, for that reason, I think there are limits to it. But when you're talking about China before, you have always to remember we are not only speaking about the PRC, we are speaking also about what is left of the freedom in Hong Kong, university in Hong Kong. I was there at colloquia, the technical university. We are speaking also of Singapore. And the Singaporean university is absolutely extraordinary. So for that reason, we are speaking about, a Chinese part of the world that is not simply limited to the PRC. And don't forget Taiwan itself.
Yeah.
Which is a where I have also PhD students, former PhD students, a very, very creative place. There's one thing that I wanted to tell Ben about his portrayal of being living in France. I have pursued for some time the extraordinary career of W. Du Bois. The most famous American black intellectual. And he had a very interesting relationship to Germany from 1892, where he was a graduate student at the Berlin University. He couldn't finish there because he didn't have money enough, so he went to Harvard and got his PhD there. But he went back to Germany again and again. The last time he was there was in 1937. For 5 months, he traveled in Nazi Germany.
Wow.
And the most surprising thing that he describes before he then leaves Germany through the Soviet Union to China, just the moment in 1937 when Imperial Japan attacks Shanghai. Then he comes to Hawaii and he falls in love with the mingling of races in this place. For him, Hawaii became the future that he wanted to be.
Yeah.
But what he said about Germany at that time was very fascinating. He said, I was never rejected.
No.
Wherever I went, whether it's hotel, whether it was the Bayreuth, the Wagner Festival, I could go wherever I wanted to. And I was invited by colleagues, to their home. And then he adds a very strange note. He said, would that have happened in Chicago? Would I have been invited would that have happened in Cambridge?
Would it have happened if he told him he was Jewish?
Then it would not. And that is that is the very fascinating thing. This guy, Du Bois, with his Southern Black experiences, realized what was happening to Jews in Germany. And he compares segregated America with Nazi Germany. And then he, for some strange reason, and I think I still have not come to terms with it, he thought it would be only temporary.
Uh,
Uh, I mean, there's a book, with essays about foreigners uh, visiting Nazi Germany, and one of that is by Du Bois, and that description is somewhat peculiar.
Manfred, thank you. Let's see, who hasn't spoken for final comments? I'm saving you, Ben. I'm saving you for the most profound comments of all, if you don't mind. Jean, why don't you give us your final comments?
Well, with respect to what's happening today, going back to our original subject of are Americans, are we experiencing a brain drain? We are both domestically and foreign terms. We are. We are seeing major intellectuals uh, going to Canada, which is the easiest place to go to escape to, and to places like the UK, which I said the Anglophone countries are the preferred ones. And we're talking about what are called elites, but we know are really people from all walks of life because universities educated probably more kids from the lower economic status than they ever have been before. And this whole process of diversity in America has been severely disrupted by a racist regime. So that's why people are escaping. They're escaping largely, it's the educated class and the brain drain. At the same time, this regime is restricting anyone who is not white from coming into the country.
Except in South Africa, in the case of the Afrikaners.
South African farmers are not the creme de la creme. From India and China who are applying to come here, whose visas are being stopped abroad, they are the best and the brightest because they're not white. Let's face it. Let's really cut to the chase here. What we're experiencing is the targeting of non white people while the United States is having not only a brain drain, but a demographic decline among white Americans to the detriment over time of both our superiority in the world in terms of achievements and contributions to the future of the human race, and also a loss of diversity and an openness toward the world. This is going to impact us down the line, not right away, in terms of our leadership in this world, and the world is going to suffer the consequences.
Okay, all right. What a great setup for you, Ben. Your final profundity now.
well, first of all, yes, everyone in the world thinks that they are exceptional, but really, the French are the only civilized. Everyone else is. I, no, I understand. You notice my condescension in the way I said that, Gene. Of course, everyone else thinks, but the French are the only civilized. Just accept it, madam. Just accept it. I'm channeling things I saw. Okay, guys. The unfortunate thing for the United States, I think, and I think actually something more broadly also, is I think we are on the verge of a very terrible time to be entry level, early job career with the introduction of artificial intelligence. That there's going to be, I saw one of the guys who heads Palantir talking about, I think $3 trillion worth of the American economy is essentially labor, right? And he's saying we're going to knock out 2 trillion of that. That's people's work. That's that's, and so you're going to have these, literally what is it? The reserve army of the poor was the famous aim of people who have nothing in this country. And I think it's also going to have impacts in other countries. The problem with the United States is we don't have a safety net. We're in the process of dismantling it, as opposed to, I think, in places like Europe, the ravages of what is coming will be tempered to a certain extent by the nature of the community there. So that may be one other reason why you'll see, Americans going overseas too, because there's really the opportunities, unless you are at a particular level, may be really limited. And if you're at a particular level, the opportunities may be much more interesting too. So that's the second thought. The third thought is I really appreciated how Manfred, you talked about W.B. Du Bois' experience in 37. It's wonderful because one of the things that happens in the United States, and I've seen this happen, is that if someone was a foreigner, like an African, particularly during segregation, they would actually be more well accepted in the South than the local black. I mean, if a guy was a Nigerian student at University of North Carolina wearing his Nigerian outfit, he would eat with the whites, you know, because he was, as opposed to some North Carolinian, I mean, these kinds of things, the foreigner thing has a certain resonance, even in Nazi Germany, right? That it's the idea of what is it? Welcoming the visitor, right? In different cultures, very strong, right? And so, you know, at the same time, it's kind of a schizophrenic thing, right? Because you think of what the horror is going on at the same time, right? I mean, in France, for example, and during the Algerian War, 57-61, there was a police riot where all kinds of Algerians living in Paris were killed and filled the Seine River with their bodies. And you can't get the people in France to talk about that. But it's part of the history, right? And so, the animosities that you see, you watch them. I always wanted, and now I've got to read this W.E. Du Bois thing. I wanted to have a black German write about what it was like to be in Nazi Germany as growing up. And there was actually a guy named Massaquoi who ended up being the executive editor of Ebony, who was born to a white German woman and a Liberian diplomat. He wanted her to come back to Liberia. She ultimately refused and kept and he grew up in Nazi Germany. And there's a picture on the front of his book. He's like 4 years old with a swastika, wearing a swastika as a 4-year-old, right? And the book is fascinating to watch sort of the way it played in terms of being a black German in Germany during the Nazi era. That's one of the fantasies I've had is to see somebody write about this. Anyway, what's wonderful about you all and what's wonderful about the world is that there is possibility. This is the romantic in me, Jake. There is possibility for just a bit of us to connect in ways that are not stereotypes at all, except that the French are the only civilized.
Tim, can you give a kind of wraparound on this show? I mean, what did we cover here? What did we learn here? How should we feel about the loss of our best and brightest? Um, what's your thought about that?
Well, we covered everything under the sun, but not enough. Particularly why people migrate and go to foreign countries. What's the cause of brain drain, or soon to be brain drain in the United States, going to Canada or where else? And what's the cause of that? And it comes down to how we treat and how we think of our fellow citizens or non-citizens. And there lies the difference between other countries, Europe, Asia versus the United States. And it's time for the United States to get over this back way of thinking about how people are not contributing, but they're being kept from contributing because of their differences. So build bridges, not walls.
After 9/11, the French newspapers said that, and you can correct me on this, Ben, nous sommes tous l'Américain.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure they would say that today.
Yeah.
Thanks so much to Tim Apicella, Ben Davis, Gene Rosenfeld, and Manfred Henningsen. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Keeping the World Company. We've been discussing sending away our best and brightest to an American diaspora. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.